His hands trembled over the man who destroyed everything. Dr. Michael Lawson saw the tattoo, a serpent coiled around a dagger, and 10 years collapsed into this single moment. Ray Vance, the drunk driver, Emma's killer. The monitors beeped steadily, indifferent to the war raging beneath Michael's surgical mask, indifferent to the choice burning through his chest like a blade. He could let go. No one would know, but Emma's face filled his vision, her voice a whisper through the years, and his fingers found their purpose again. This is where vengeance dies and grace is born in blood and tears. The emergency room doors exploded open with the violence of sirens and shouted commands, and Dr. Michael Lawson moved through the chaos with the practiced efficiency of a man who had spent 3 decades navigating the border between life and death. His scrubs were already stained from an earlier surgery, a teenager with a ruptured spleen, and fatigue pressed against his temples like a constant companion. But his hands remained steady as he approached the gurney where a man lay bleeding from a gunshot wound to the abdomen. The paramedics rattled off vitals with mechanical precision, blood pressure dropping, heart rate erratic, penetrating trauma to the lower left quadrant, and Michael absorbed the information without emotion, his mind already constructing the surgical roadmap that would determine whether this stranger lived or died. The fluorescent lights overhead cast everything in harsh clarity, turning blood into something almost artificial, and he noticed the man's face was obscured by an oxygen mask, his body convulsing slightly with each labored breath. There was nothing unusual about this moment, nothing to distinguish it from 1,000 other emergencies he had navigated, yet something whispered at the edge of his consciousness, a premonition he could not name. They moved the patient into operating room 3 with practiced choreography, the surgical team assembling around the table like musicians preparing for a performance they had rehearsed countless times. Michael scrubbed in with methodical precision, watching the water cascade over his forearms, carrying away the residue of the day, and he thought briefly of Emma, as he always did before a difficult case, her smile a talisman he carried into every surgery. The anesthesiologist confirmed the patient was under, and Michael made his first incision with the confidence of absolute focus, his world narrowing to the red landscape of muscle and tissue beneath his hands. The bullet had torn through the intestinal wall and nicked the femoral artery, and he worked quickly to control the bleeding, his fingers moving with the certainty that came from years of training and instinct. The nurses anticipated his needs before he spoke, passing instruments with seamless timing, and the monitors provided their constant symphony of beeps and rhythms, the technological heartbeat that kept death at bay. For 20 minutes, he existed in that state of pure concentration, where nothing existed beyond the immediate task, where his identity dissolved into purpose. Then he shifted his position to access a deeper bleeder, and his eyes traveled down the patient's left arm, where the sleeve of the hospital gown had been cut away, and he saw it, a tattoo rendered in bold black ink, a serpent coiled around a dagger with such distinctive detail that recognition struck him like a physical blow. His hands froze mid-motion, the clamp suspended above the surgical field, and time seemed to fracture into fragments of impossible clarity. That tattoo, he had seen it before, had stared at it across a courtroom 10 years ago, had memorized every curve and line during the trial, had dreamed of it in the dark hours when sleep refused to come. Ray Vance. The name materialized in his mind with the weight of a gravestone. And suddenly, the sterile operating room transformed into something else entirely, a theater where past and present collided with devastating force. His daughter's face filled his vision, Emma at 16, her laughter bright and unguarded, her future stretching before her like an endless road, and then the other image, the one that haunted him still, her broken body on the pavement, the life extinguished by this man's drunken choice. The surgical nurse's voice cut through his paralysis, asking if everything was all right, and Michael forced himself to breathe, to remember where he was, to feel the weight of the instruments in his hands. The patient was bleeding, actively dying, and his inaction was a choice in itself, a silent verdict that would end a life as surely as any deliberate act. He looked at Ray Vance's face, slack with anesthesia, peaceful in a way that seemed obscene given the history between them, and rage rose in his throat like bile. This was the man who had stolen everything, who had served only 3 years for taking Emma from the world, who had walked free while Michael's family disintegrated into grief and silence. The monitors began to alarm, the blood pressure dropping into dangerous territory, and he realized with cold clarity that he held absolute power in this moment. He could step back, could cite some medical complication, could let nature take its course while the team scrambled to understand. No one would question him. No one would know. The choice was his alone, and it burned through him like acid. But then another memory surfaced, unbidden and unwelcome. Emma in the hospital volunteer wing where she spent her weekends, her hands gentle with the elderly patients, her voice full of compassion as she read to a dying man. She had wanted to be a doctor, had inherited Michael's belief that medicine was sacred, that every life held intrinsic worth regardless of circumstance. He remembered their conversations about the oath, about what it meant to stand between a person and death, about the responsibility that came with such power. She had believed in him, had seen him as someone who represented the best of what healing could be, and the thought of her watching him now, seeing him choose vengeance over principle, was unbearable. His hands began to move again, almost against his will, finding the bleeder and clamping it with mechanical precision. The decision was made, though he could not have said whether he chose it or whether it chose him, and he continued the surgery with a focus that felt like violence turned inward. The operation stretched across 90 minutes of meticulous reconstruction, and Michael worked with an intensity that bordered on fury, as if by saving Ray Vance's life he could somehow prove something to himself or to the ghost of his daughter. He repaired the torn intestine with sutures so precise they could have been works of art, cauterized vessels with controlled aggression, and checked every inch of the abdominal cavity for missed injuries with a thoroughness that went beyond medical necessity. The surgical team sensed the tension radiating from him, but said nothing, moving around him with careful deference, and he was grateful for their silence because he had no words to explain what was happening in the cramped space between his ribs. When he finally stepped back and announced the closure, his voice sounded strange to his own ears, hollow and distant, and he watched as the residents took over the final sutures. Ray Vance would live, would wake in recovery with no knowledge of the man who had saved him, would walk out of this hospital and back into whatever life he had constructed in the years since Emma's death, and Michael felt nothing but a vast emptiness where his rage had been. Michael stripped off his gloves with movements that felt disconnected from his body, dropping them into the biohazard container with a finality that echoed through the scrub room. His hands were shaking now, the tremors he had suppressed during surgery manifesting with a vengeance, and he gripped the edge of the sink to steady himself as he stared at his reflection in the polished metal. The face looking back at him seemed older than it had this morning, the lines around his eyes deeper, the grey in his hair more pronounced, and he wondered if this was what transformation looked like. This hollowed-out version of a man who had just performed the most difficult act of his life. The water ran hot over his forearms, turning his skin red, and he scrubbed with an urgency that had nothing to do with hygiene, as if he could wash away the last 90 minutes, could erase the choice he had made and the cost it would extract from his soul. Outside the door, the hospital continued its perpetual motion, but in this small space, time felt suspended, trapped in the amber of his own disbelief. He had saved Ray Vance. The reality of it settled over him like a weight pressing down on his chest, making it difficult to breathe, and he leaned forward, bracing himself against the sink as a wave of nausea rolled through him. All the years of grief, the nights he had lain awake imagining vengeance, the fantasies of justice that had sustained him through the emptiness, all of it had culminated in this moment where he had chosen to save the man who destroyed his world. The irony was so cruel it almost felt like cosmic mockery, and he let out a sound that was half laugh, half sob, his composure finally cracking. Emma would have been 26 now, would have finished medical school, would have been starting her residency, and instead she was frozen forever at 16, her potential erased by a drunk driver who had walked away with barely a scratch and a sentence that amounted to nothing. Michael had attended every day of the trial, had listened to Ray Vance's half-hearted apology, had watched him show more concern for his own future than for the life he had taken, and the rage he had felt then was nothing compared to the complex agony he felt now. The door opened, and Dr. Patricia Chen entered, her expression carefully neutral as she moved to the adjacent sink, and Michael straightened, forcing his face into something resembling professional composure. Patricia had been his colleague for 15 years, had been at Emma's funeral, had seen him at his worst in the months that followed, and he knew she could read the devastation written across his features. She washed her hands in silence for a long moment before speaking, her voice gentle but direct, asking if he was all right, and Michael wanted to laugh at the absurdity of the question. How could he explain what had just happened, the recognition that had stopped his heart, the choice that had nearly broken him? He told her he was fine, the lie falling easily from his lips, and she studied him with the shrewd assessment of someone who knew him too well to believe it. She mentioned that the patient in OR 3 was stable, that he had done excellent work under difficult circumstances, and something in her tone suggested she knew more than she was saying, that perhaps she had recognized something in his behavior during the surgery. Michael avoided her gaze, focusing instead on drying his hands with methodical care, each movement deliberate as he tried to anchor himself in the physical world. He could not tell her the truth, could not admit that he had just saved his daughter's killer, because saying it aloud would make it real in a way he was not prepared to face. Patricia placed a hand on his shoulder, a brief gesture of solidarity, and told him that what he had done today mattered, that he had honored his oath and his daughter's memory, and the words hit him like a punch to the sternum. She left without waiting for a response, the door swinging shut behind her, and Michael was alone again with the terrible knowledge of what he had chosen. The Hippocratic oath had never felt like such a burden, never demanded so much, and he wondered if he had the strength to bear the weight of this decision, or if it would crush him beneath its impossible gravity. He changed out of his surgical scrubs mechanically, pulling on his street clothes with hands that still trembled, and caught sight of his phone on the shelf where he had left it before the surgery. There were messages from his ex-wife, Sarah, routine updates about their son's baseball game that felt impossibly distant from his current reality, and he could not bring himself to respond. Sarah had left him 5 years after Emma's death, unable to bridge the chasm that grief had carved between them, and he did not blame her for it. They had both become different people in the aftermath, strangers navigating separate wastelands of loss, and eventually the effort of pretending had become more exhausting than the loneliness of separation. He thought about calling her now, telling her what had happened, but the words would not form, and he knew she would not understand why he had saved Ray Vance when they had both spent years wishing him harm. Some choices existed beyond explanation, beyond the reach of logic, and this was one of them. Michael walked through the hospital corridors with no destination in mind, passing nurses and residents who nodded in greeting, their faces blurring into anonymity. His feet carried him past the cafeteria where the smell of coffee and antiseptic mingled, past the waiting room where families sat in various stages of hope and despair, and he felt like a ghost moving through a world that no longer made sense. Everything looked the same as it had this morning: the scuffed linoleum floors, the flickering fluorescent lights, the bulletin boards covered in staff announcements. But he was fundamentally changed, reshaped by a choice that had cost him something he could not yet name. He found himself in front of the hospital chapel, a small interfaith space tucked away on the second floor that he had avoided for 10 years, and his hand reached for the door before his mind could question the impulse. The chapel was empty, silent except for the muted sounds of the hospital beyond its walls, and he stepped inside, letting the door close behind him with a soft click that sounded like finality. The chapel was smaller than he remembered, a modest room with rows of simple wooden chairs facing a raised platform where symbols from various faiths were displayed in careful equality: a cross, a star, a crescent, a wheel, each representing different paths to the same universal questions about suffering and meaning. Michael stood in the doorway for a long moment, his body resistant to entering this space that represented everything he had abandoned in the wake of Emma's passing, and he felt the old anger rise in his throat, bitter and familiar. He had stopped believing in any benevolent force the day his daughter was taken from him, had rejected the hollow comfort of faith when it offered no explanation for why a 16-year-old girl, with her whole life ahead of her, had been erased by a man too selfish to call a taxi. Prayer had seemed like a cruel joke, and he had walked away from it without looking back, choosing instead the cold certainty of science and the tangible reality of flesh and blood. Yet here he was, drawn to this place by an instinct he did not understand, seeking something he could not name. He moved forward slowly, his footsteps muted by the thin carpet, and chose a chair in the middle of the room where shadows pooled in the corners, and the dim lighting created an atmosphere of hushed introspection. The silence pressed against his ears, so different from the constant noise of the emergency room, and he realized he could hear his own breathing, ragged and uneven, betraying the turmoil churning beneath his surface. Michael leaned forward, elbows on his knees, face buried in his hands, and the facade he had maintained since leaving the operating room finally shattered. The sobs came from somewhere deep in his chest, wrenching sounds that he had not permitted himself to make in years, and he let them come, too exhausted to fight anymore. He cried for Emma, for the girl she had been and the woman she would never become, for her laughter that still echoed in his memory and her absence that carved through every day. He cried for himself, for the father who had failed to protect her, for the surgeon who had just saved the man responsible for her destruction, for the terrible, impossible choice that had revealed him to himself in ways he had not wanted to see. The tears eventually subsided, leaving him empty and raw, and he sat back in the chair, staring at the symbols on the platform without really seeing them. He thought about what Patricia had said, that he had honored his daughter's memory, and the words felt both true and devastatingly insufficient. Emma would have wanted him to save Ray Vance, of this he was certain, because she had possessed a capacity for compassion that had always humbled him, a belief in the inherent value of life that transcended circumstance. She had seen the world with a clarity he envied, had understood instinctively what he had to learn through painful experience, that forgiveness was not about absolving others, but about freeing yourself from the prison of hatred. Michael had not forgiven Ray Vance, could not imagine a universe where such forgiveness was possible, but he had chosen not to become his daughter's destroyer, had refused to let vengeance transform him into something she would not recognize. The distinction felt important, though it brought no peace, only a weary acceptance that this was all he could offer. He wondered if Ray Vance would ever know whose hands had saved him, if he would wake in recovery with any awareness of the profound irony of his survival, and the thought made Michael's jaw tighten. Part of him wanted confrontation, wanted to stand over the man's bed and force him to see the face of the person he had destroyed, to make him understand the magnitude of what had been taken and what had just been given. But he knew such a confrontation would serve no purpose except to satisfy his own need for acknowledgement. And Emma had taught him that real strength lay in choosing dignity over drama, in walking away from the empty satisfaction of making others witness your pain. So he would not confront Ray Vance, would not reveal himself, would let the man return to his life without ever knowing the debt he owed. The anonymity of his mercy felt like both a gift and a punishment, a way of maintaining the moral high ground while simultaneously denying himself the catharsis of recognition. The door to the chapel opened, and an elderly woman entered, moving with the careful slowness of advanced age, and Michael straightened, wiping his face with his palms, suddenly self-conscious about his emotional display. The woman nodded to him with gentle understanding, as if tears in this space were expected and unremarkable, and she took a seat several rows behind him, bowing her head in silent prayer. Her presence was oddly comforting, a reminder that he was not alone in his suffering, that this chapel held countless stories of grief and hope, of questions without answers and pain without remedy. Michael found himself envying her faith, the way she seemed to find solace in the act of prayer, and he wondered what it would be like to believe that someone was listening, that this universe held meaning beyond the random collision of circumstance and consequence. He had once believed, had raised Emma in the church, had found comfort in the rituals and certainties of organized faith, but that version of himself felt impossibly distant now, separated by a chasm of loss and disillusionment. He stood to leave, his body stiff from sitting, and paused at the door to look back at the symbols on the platform, the representations of humanity's eternal search for transcendence. In saving Ray Vance, he had not found faith, had not experienced some transformative moment of spiritual awakening, but perhaps he had found something else, a recognition that he could still choose who he wanted to be, despite the unbearable weight of his grief. Emma's death had given him every reason to become bitter and small, to let vengeance define him, to surrender to the darkness that had threatened to consume him. But in that operating room, with his daughter's killer dying beneath his hands, he had chosen differently. The choice had not healed him, had not erased the pain or brought Emma back, but it had proven that love could be stronger than hate, that the man Emma believed him to be still existed somewhere beneath the scar tissue. As he left the chapel, Michael felt the faint stirring of something that might eventually become peace, though he knew the road to that destination would be long and he would walk it alone. Michael left the hospital as the sun was setting, painting the Houston sky in shades of amber and crimson that reminded him of surgical lighting and blood, and he walked to his car with movements that felt mechanical, disconnected. The parking garage was nearly empty at this hour, the evening shift having already arrived and the day staff long gone, and his footsteps echoed against concrete with a hollow sound that matched the emptiness inside his chest. He sat in the driver's seat without turning on the engine, staring through the windshield at nothing, and the events of the day replayed in his mind with relentless clarity. The tattoo, the recognition, the choice, the surgery, the chapel. He felt fundamentally altered, as if some essential part of him had been surgically removed and replaced with something harder and more uncertain. And he did not know yet whether this transformation would prove to be a kind of salvation or just another form of suffering. The radio remained silent, and he was grateful for the quiet, for the absence of voices trying to fill the space that loss had carved. He finally drove home, through streets he had navigated 1,000 times, past landmarks that held no meaning, through neighborhoods where families were sitting down to dinner and the world continued its ordinary rotation. Michael's house was dark when he arrived, the windows reflecting nothing back at him, and he realized he had not been home before midnight in weeks, had been filling his hours with surgeries and administrative work, anything to avoid the silence that waited for him in these empty rooms. He unlocked the door and stepped into the foyer where Emma's graduation photo still hung on the wall, her smile frozen in that moment of triumph and anticipation, and he paused to look at it as he did every night, searching her face for answers she could no longer provide. She looked impossibly young, impossibly alive, and the contrast between that vibrant girl and the cold reality of her absence was a wound that never fully closed. Michael moved through the house, turning on lights, pushing back the shadows, and found himself in the kitchen, where he poured a glass of whiskey he did not want but drank anyway, the burn in his throat a welcome distraction from the ache in his chest. He thought about calling his son Daniel, who was away at college and navigating his own relationship with grief, but the hour was late and he did not trust himself to maintain composure. Daniel had been 12 when Emma died, had lost his sister, and then watched his parents' marriage disintegrate, and Michael carried guilt about that too, about his inability to be the father Daniel needed while drowning in his own sorrow. They spoke every week, careful conversations that skirted around the things that mattered most, and Michael wondered if they would ever find their way back to the easy intimacy they had once shared, or if Emma's absence had permanently fractured something between them. Some losses created distance that could not be bridged, and he feared this was one of them. He wandered into his study, where medical journals and patient files created topography on every surface, and sank into the leather chair behind his desk that had molded itself to his shape over the years. On the shelf above his computer sat a small wooden box that he had not opened in months, and now his hands reached for it with the inevitability of ritual, lifting the lid to reveal the contents he had memorized through countless examinations. Inside were Emma's belongings from the accident, her phone with its cracked screen, the bracelet she had been wearing, a few coins, and a folded piece of paper that the police had found in her pocket. Michael unfolded the paper with hands that had performed surgery on the man who killed her, and read her handwriting one more time. The words she had written in some idle moment before leaving for the party where her life would end. The note said simply, "Dad, don't forget, we're stronger than we think. Love you infinity. E." The words struck him with the force they always did. A message from beyond the grave that felt both comforting and unbearably cruel, and Michael understood with sudden clarity why he had made the choice he made today. Emma had believed in his strength, had trusted that he would choose correctly even when the right path was the hardest one, and in saving Ray Vance, he had proven her faith was not misplaced. He had not done it for the oath or for God or for any abstract principle. He had done it for her, for the daughter who saw the best in him and called him to be worthy of that vision. The realization brought a strange kind of relief, a sense that, despite everything, despite the loss and the rage and the years of wandering in darkness, he had not completely lost himself. Emma's legacy was not just her death, but the way she had lived, the compassion and courage she had embodied, and by choosing life over vengeance, he had kept that legacy alive. Michael folded the note and returned it to the box, closing the lid with a gentleness that bordered on reverence, and he sat back in his chair, feeling the exhaustion of the day settle into his bones. Tomorrow, Ray Vance would wake up in recovery with no knowledge of the miracle he had been granted, would return to his life unaware that he owed his survival to the man whose world he had destroyed, and Michael would return to the hospital and continue the work of saving lives because that was who he was, who Emma had believed him to be. The grief would remain. He knew it would never truly leave. would always be there in the quiet moments and the empty spaces. But perhaps grief and grace could coexist, could occupy the same heart without destroying it. He had saved the life of his daughter's killer, and in doing so had saved something of himself, had chosen to honor her memory not through vengeance, but through an act of impossible mercy that cost him everything and gave him back the only thing that mattered, his integrity. As Michael turned off the lights and climbed the stairs to his bedroom, he felt Emma's presence not as a ghost, but as a guiding principle, a north star by which he could navigate the darkness. She would never know what he had done today, would never witness the choice that had nearly broken him, but somehow he felt her approval, her gentle pride in the father who had found the strength to be better than his pain. The night stretched ahead with its familiar emptiness, and he faced it with a weariness that was somehow lighter than before. As if by walking through the fire of this impossible day, he had emerged not unscathed, but transformed, carrying scars that would become part of his story rather than the end of it. Dr. Michael Lawson had saved many lives in his career, but today he had saved one that mattered in ways that transcended medicine, had proven that love could be stronger than hate, that grace could triumph over vengeance, and that even in our darkest moments we can choose to be worthy of those we have lost.